All right, there we go. Let's hear a little bit of that. It's us. What you're seeing is us. It's our history, it's our present, it's our future. But one of the things I want to start out with is I want to take us also on a little bit of a journey and kind of a walk as to our beginnings and a little bit of our history and where it plays into this. So this was really a great way to kind of tee off just some brief thoughts that I want to give you this afternoon. We have talked in great length at some incredibly important topics for the career field today. And so this is what I want to do to tie it up. And as I tie it up by talking about our history and our past, one of the things I want to do is make sure to annotate, it's about our people. The airmen that are coming to us today, much like the airmen that came to us over decades and generations, come to us from all walks of life. Some of them came to us with great upbringings, great schools, amazing stabilities, and something inside of them brought this yearning to serve their country. We have airmen and people that come to us, young men and women that grew up in military families. They PCS'd all over the world. They were known and are proud to be called brats. And those brats wanted to follow in the traditions that their mothers and fathers laid for them and come in and have the opportunity to serve themselves. And we have got young men and women that come to us that didn't grow up with 2 nickels to rub together. And coming in the Air Force as a defender is their first chance in life. They've got something to make of themselves where they can control it and do it by themselves and become a part of a family and become a part of a community. So whether it is through peace and war, through toil and strife, all of the things that you see on these slides and the people and the images there represent the face of America. And the face of America is what made us successful. And so when we go back to our origins, what I want to do is really call on the aspects of initial air power theory, and let's go to Julio Duhay. And what Julio Duhay talked about and annotated as an air marshal was that the birds of prey were far easier to destroy in the nest than they were to take out in the air. And for generations, when our air power was actualized, and what was proving to people is that you couldn't touch us in the air because of our capability. What it meant is that Julio Duhay was right. It is the birds in the nest. It's the eggs in the nest that are a vulnerable place. And you need to have guardians on the line, and you need to have defenders on the line that ensure that the eggs in the nest are safe so that they can raise and become the birds of the prey in the air. And what we saw and heard General Robinson talk to us about this morning was the origins before we even entered World War II. On the capture of Crete. And when we saw what those abilities were, and when we saw what the RAF was struggling with, and we saw that what Churchill was trying to do was to make sure that people know whether you grab a pike, whether you grab a club, whether you grab a Tommy gun, air bases cannot be the havens for people in the primes of their lives relaxing while others go forward to fight the war. Because what we knew is that the Germans were coming for us. What we knew is that the Japanese were coming for us in that time. And so as we built that aspect out, what Churchill knew in the aspect of deforming the regiment was that you needed to have a dedicated defense force for the regiment, for the air bases that allowed the air power to actualize. And as this grew, our own history, and as we formalized ourselves in the military police, and as the Air Corps was coming into its own, what you find is that as we're looking at our very needs today, it goes back to our very origins, because the base defense battalions came out of the segregated military at the time. They were our African American battalions that were part of the military police, and they were designated as base defense battalions for the sole purpose of protecting the Air Force as we move forward. That is an amazing impact of our history as military police and base defense battalions came together underneath the Army Air Corps construct. And that continued as we became the fledgling Air Force that we were in 1947. And as the military police was moving forward, we continued to carry on that name. And in 1948, we got the moniker of being Air Police. It was something that was going to be our own. It was something that was unique. It was that final separation that we needed on the fact that we owned air power, and that air power needed to have a specific designation on what our forces looked like that protected, defended, and guaranteed it. And so we became Air Police, but also in 1948 became the desegregation of the military. And so what we saw was our force coming together from the segregated base defense battalions and military police to a unitary air police construct That was us. And as we heard through the discussions that were taking place and the history that was laid out before us, we learned valuable lessons in the form of blood during the Korean conflict. When Kimpo was overrun and it identified how just ill-prepared we were from the aspect on losing what we had done so well in the Second World War and losing that function as we were transitioning ourselves to a near Air Force, how did we need to make sure we were organized and trained? How do we need to make sure that we were able to capture the essence of guaranteeing that air power to fly? And so what was actually pretty amazing is when you see the roots of what we see in modern base defense, it really roots to strategic air command. General LeMay was incessant on the aspect of security. General LeMay was incessant on the means that those weapon systems, those strategic weapon systems in our nuclear enterprise would never be touched. And so the effort that he put in, such as the airman that was talking, that told us that that was the foundation of combat arms, to give it a writ large application to the Air Force, what it also meant is that nobody was crossing that red line. Nobody was reaching the bombers. Nobody was getting to the missiles, because at that time, the air police were taking the charge, and that brings us into the transition of what we start to come as the security police. Because what General LeMay and other air power leaders were realizing was the fact that this aspect that we were doing was far beyond simply a police moniker, and that the security that came with it was the guarantee of the weapon systems along with it. And that began to build this aspect of this combat foundation that we had. And as we saw ourselves in the throes of Vietnam, which had been started years before this aspect, but truly from an Air Force standpoint, when we had the 1041st Test Squadron get stood up by looking at what was going to form our combat security police squadrons, and in the throes of the Tet Offensive at places like Tan Son Nhut, as places like Cam Ranh Bay, as places like Da Nang, it was the combat security police formulating base defense and protecting and guaranteeing the application of that air power, because what the Tet Offensive brought was a level of offensiveness and coordination that we had not seen throughout the war. And we cut our teeth, and we earned our reputation. And from that point on, that aspect of what we did during that time of war set into motion what was truly going to be formed as a pretty amazing culture. And I love the fact that we got some great pictures, and you're going to see some familiar faces back here. So I'm trying to look over my shoulder as well. Gee, I think we know that guy as well. But look at it. It's us. It's our history. And what that also turned into was incredible change that was following it. And the change that followed it led to us bringing women into the career field as law enforcement specialists. Then in the 1980s, we were bringing women in further to the career field and bringing them in as security specialists. So really, we were integrated across the board in that face of America that I was talking about. But the mission sets were rising. We were in the throes of the Cold War. The moniker of being a peacekeeper meant something during that time, when we formed ourselves into organizations like GLICM in Europe, and the pride that came from being associated with those units in that core aspect of picking up and moving and defending yourself wherever you were at. That was tremendous in our ability to actually fight and win the Cold War. So as the security police during that time continue on this amazing ability of watching the Iron Curtain fall in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall and watching the crumbling of the Soviet bloc, you know that the mission that was accomplished during those times guaranteed that success, but it meant that we as a country were having an identity crisis. We had been fighting a peer competitor for generations. We had been in the throes of a Cold War where the aspect of mutually assured destruction was omnipresent. And as we were transitioning these missions, we were watching the world transition around us, because the void that was originally filled with the Soviet Union to provide stability in places across the world was now gone. That meant that the rise of humanitarian missions, the rise of terrorism was now on our front door. And in 1997, the belief was that we needed to take the career field and continue that transition. That transition needed to rise from more than just security police, but the aspect that we were a security force. And that as security forces, we were dealing with diverse missions across the globe and having to have a level of flexibility and professionalism that went along with it. And then our world changed on September 11, 2001. And probably most people in this room will remember exactly where you were at that time. And as many of us were dealing with the throes of that and watching our career field change, what we saw was almost this rebirth of this concept of the safe side beliefs. The concept of what it meant to be a combat security police squadron as we rotate ourselves into security forces. And we found ourselves doing things like Task Force 1041 out at Balad. And we found ourselves in Bagram controlling 220 square miles of battle space as a part of Task Force 1455. And reputation that we established by understanding that putting air-minded defenders responsible for the defense of an installation became a matter of reputation and pride. People like General Goldfein saw exactly what we were doing and how much effect you could bring to the battle space when you put an airman in sector and not rely on the ability of the Army to defend and secure your air bases. It's us. We did this, and we did it well, and we earned our reputation, and we earned it with blood and tears and sweat and joy and pain. And there are people in this room that bear the memories and marks on them that helped to be a part of this as we grew through this. But now we find ourselves in something different. We find ourselves in a world that's changing. We find ourselves looking again down the barrel of peer competition and looking at ourselves again with a type of force and a type of adversary that has the ability to look at us and determine their destiny and having the power and capability and will to do so. And so we find ourselves in a place where we need to look at what we're doing as an Air Force, with our foundation in what base defense is, based on what we had been doing for the last 25 years before, and the reputation we built in front of it. Now it becomes even more essential. The concept of base defense, the aspect on the need to ensure from an agile combat employment in the world that's changing around us, what we're watching in Ukraine, what we're watching develop in the South China Sea. All of this now will define what we become in the future and being what the Air Force needs us to be. Defender family, it's time for a change. It's time for a change as we look to that mission that's ahead of us and what the Air Force needs. It's time for a change in how we see where we contribute ourselves, how we're organized, the mentality we bring along with it. It is time for a change because the Air Force needs that change. Our airmen demand the change, and the very security of the country is vested in that change. And Defender family, I will tell you right now, change is coming. So be ready.